This week I thought I'd look at what to look for if you're thinking of buying a Moto Guzzi LeMans 1000. Now, this is a 1991 model, but the Moto Guzzi LeMans traces its roots right back to 1969 when Lino Tonti, the Moto Guzzi factory engineer, designed the Tonti frame for Moto Guzzi's racing program. And from that evolved the V7 Sport, which was released in 1971. And a few years later, the 850 Le Mans came into being. And at the time, it was considered one of the most sporting motorcycles of its era. But Moto Guzzi really rested on their laurels a bit, and they had a hard financial times as well, because over the coming years, they really just made minor changes to that motorcycle all the way from 1976 right through to 1993, which is a very long production run for a motorcycle model. Yes, there were changes. The earlier ones were 850. Then in 1984, Le Mans 1000 was released, which is commonly called the Mark IV. And the major difference between the Mark IV and this, which is usually referred to as a Mark V, is the fact that this has a half fairing on it, whereas the Mark IV has a handlebar mounted sort of bikini fairing on it. There are other minor differences as well, but they are essentially the same motorcycle. Now, the things to look for in these motorcycles, it's sort of, buying any second-hand motorcycle is difficult if you don't know the service history. So if you can find one with a good service history, you're in front, because you really don't know what's under the skin. I mean, this one is 25 years old, and some of the earlier models will be even older, of course. So, there are going to be problems lurking under the skin that you may or may not be able to tell just by test riding it. Now, when I rode this, I noticed that there was a weave in the steering at low speed, which is an indicator that the steering head bearings were either notchy, had flats on them, or were tight or lacking lubrication. So I was aware of that, but the bike pretty much looked as it does now, and it looked very presentable. So I bought it. I mean, I got a good price for it at the time. I mean, the Le Mans 1000s aren't as highly sought after as the earlier ones. Part of that is due to the styling. The earlier ones are considered a classically styled Moto Guzzi Le Mans, whereas these ones were a little bit unloved in their day, but they're essentially still a good motorcycle. So over the next 6 months, I had to do a number of things to this motorcycle. I knew the steering head bearing needed to be done, but when I took the front wheel out, I realised that the wheel bearings were in pretty poor condition. So they needed to be replaced. I thought, well, since the front are in poor condition, the rear are probably poor, and I was right, the rear wheel bearings also needed to be replaced. And while I was at it, we replaced the swing arm bearings as well, because they were getting a little tired too. I also noticed that there was pulsing in the handbrake lever under heavy braking. Now, Moto Guzzis have a linked braking system, and what this means is that the front brake lever operates just the right-hand front disc, and the foot brake lever operates the left-hand front disc and the rear disc through a proportioning valve. It was sort of a unique idea by Moto Guzzi at the time to encourage people to balance their braking and use a bit of rear as well as front. But not everyone took to it, you could say, and if you've never ridden one before, you may find it a bit surprising the first time you get on and you pull in the lever expecting something to happen, and very little happens unless you put your foot on the pedal rather hard. So obviously a previous owner had been using a lot of front brake lever, and it had caused the disc to go out of round. The other disc was fine. So I replaced both discs anyway with stainless steel discs so I could use sintered metal pads in them, and that did improve the braking performance no end. There were a few other cosmetic things that needed to be done to it. There was a foot peg rubber, one of the mirrors was incorrect, one of the rear indicator stalks was taped up, but there wasn't really that much to be done. Now, I'll come around the front and I'll just go through a couple of other things to look out for when you have a look at one of these. Okay, a couple of other things to look out for are The seal on the rear bevel is prone to leaking with age, and that's a pretty easy thing to check in that you just run your hand underneath here, and if you get gear oil on it, it's probably a good sign that the seal between the wheel and the bevel is starting to go. That's not a particularly expensive seal to replace, and a competent handyman can do it himself, no problem. Next on our list of items to check is the universal joint, which is located here at the top of the swing arm. This allows the swing arm to pivot smoothly while allowing the drive from the back of the gearbox to be transmitted to the bevel drive when the suspension causes the swing arm to move up and down. A sure sign that the universal joint is on the way out is if you get vibration in the right-hand foot peg, particularly on bumps or under heavy acceleration. Another thing to look for is the rear main seal leaking. Now the rear main seal is between the rear of the engine and the clutch. Now there's a vent underneath that you can put your finger up and run your finger along, and if you get engine oil there, it's probably a fairly good sign that the rear main seal needs replacing. And this is where I guess a service history is handy, because the rear main seal is a little bit more difficult to replace because you have to really lift the frame up off the engine and take the gearbox off. And if you're going to do that, it's worthwhile replacing the clutch if it is on its way out. And the original clutches were riveted, and they have a tendency for the rivets to come loose and eventually fail, and you really don't want that to happen on a ride. So if it's done a lot of Ks, it's over 25 years old, you may be looking at replacing the clutch if it hasn't already been done. Another fault with these Le Mans 1000s is that the valve guides have a tendency to wear. They've got fairly large valves in them at fairly steep inclined angles, and they're known for wearing out valve guides. So if it's a 25-year-old bike and it hasn't been done, it's likely that the valve guides need doing. One other thing I should point out is that the engine breather system, which uses the rear backbone under the tank as I guess as a catch tank, has a tendency to fill up with emulsified oil over time. When I did the clutch on this, I pulled the hoses off the breather system, and I got probably 3/4 of a litre of emulsified oil out of the system. So, you know, out of any old Moto Guzzi, it's worthwhile flushing the engine breather system. It'll help the bike run better as well as that. And obviously, if you're able to, it's probably worth doing a compression test just to be sure. I think that's about all from this side of the motorcycle. We'll just head on back around the other. Now, I'd also like to mention difficulties with some of the cosmetic items on these models. Since they are sort of in that cusp of being quite collectible, you're really relying on new old stock for a lot of the unique cosmetic parts on these bikes. These side panels, for example, are hard to find, and really they're made of plastic and they do crack and deteriorate. So you're reliant on new old stock. A couple of other items are fairly unique to this model. The fairing is fiberglass, so that's quite eminently repairable. I suppose you could plastic repair these. Other items that are difficult to get are these, I suppose the indicator stalks, the rubbers on these. They're on this particular model Moto Guzzi, and also they're on a Ducati 750 F1 from memory. One other item that's difficult to get are the crossover heat shields down here. I haven't seen them or been able to find them anywhere, and they have a tendency to crack from vibration and fall off. So you want to keep an eye on them, and if they start to crack, take them off and put them aside for repair. Otherwise, they're just going to break and fall off and you'll lose them. Apart from that, most of the other items are pretty much, you know, engine-wise, gearbox, all the mechanicals, exhaust system, apart from that crossover, are pretty readily available. So from that point of view, it shouldn't be too much of a problem for you. But this is probably the case with a lot of early 90s, late 80s motorcycles. They haven't attained that collector cult status yet, so there's not a ready supply of aftermarket reproduction parts for them as yet. Anyway, that's about all I've got to say on that Moto Guzzi LeMans 1000. If you want further information on the Moto Guzzi LeMans or the V7 Sport or any of the other variants, it's well worth reading this book by Ian Falloon. It covers all these bikes in great detail. And yeah, I'll see you next time.